September 21, 1327. The cold stone walls of Berkeley Castle in England stand silent witness to what would become one of the most infamous and horrific deaths in European royal history. A man once crowned king and heir to a mighty empire, now lies helpless in a prison cell, his body broken, his spirit crushed, his name fading into political shame. His final moments are said to be so grotesque, so symbolically cruel, that they echo across centuries in whispers of agony and betrayal. This is the story of Edward II, a king torn between passion and duty, whose downfall was written not only by the sword, but by scandal, politics, and a method of execution so shocking it became legend. But was the horror real? Or was it a carefully crafted lie? To find the truth, we must return to the very beginning. Edward of Caernarfon was born on April 25, 1284. The fourth surviving son of King Edward I, the formidable hammer of the Scots, and Queen Eleanor of Castile. From the very beginning, he seemed ill-suited for the burdens of monarchy, where his father was fierce, disciplined, and obsessed with military glory. Young Edward was sensitive, artistic, and strangely drawn to the lives of ordinary people. He spent his time rowing boats, digging ditches, thatching roofs, and crafting metal objects with his hands, behaviors utterly scandalous for a future monarch. While the royal court expected him to master the arts of war and chivalry, Edward seemed to seek something else entirely: connection, freedom, and above all, belonging. This quiet rebellion enraged his father. Once tore out clumps of his son's hair in a fit of fury, all because the young prince begged for a noble title for his closest companion, Piers Gaveston, charismatic knight from Gascon. Gaveston was more than a friend. He was an anchor in a world of brutal expectations and a heart that beat in sync with his own. Their bond would become the subject of whispers and condemnation, and eventually, a key element in Edward's undoing. When his elder brothers died, fate pulled Edward onto a throne he neither wanted nor was prepared to rule. He was 23 when Edward I died in 1307, and the crown passed to a young man with a gentle spirit, the storm already brewing in his court. This was the beginning of a reign defined not by conquest, but by conflict, desire, and betrayal. And it all started with a king who loved the wrong man too openly, too defiantly. When Edward II ascended the throne in 1307, one of his very first royal acts stunned the entire English court. He recalled Piers Gaveston from exile, the very man his father had banished, and bestowed upon him the powerful and prestigious title of Earl of Cornwall. This title, historically reserved for members of the royal family, was now worn by a man of foreign birth and questionable loyalty. But Edward didn't stop there. Gave Gaveston lavish gifts from the royal treasury, even the wedding jewels, meant for his new queen, Isabella of France. At the coronation, Gaveston walked beside the king, carrying St. Edward's crown, a gesture so symbolic and audacious that it enraged the nobility. To many, it was not just favoritism, it was sacrilege. And yet Edward seemed blind to the danger, or perhaps he didn't care. He was in love, if not romantically, then with a loyalty and devotion so profound it eclipsed all reason. Chroniclers from the time described the bond as a covenant of constancy, a love beyond all measure. Some modern historians view this as romantic, even homoerotic. Others argue it was simply the exaggerated language of courtly male friendship. Whatever the truth, one fact is undeniable. Edward placed Gaveston above all else, above his nobles. His wife, and even his duty as king, Isabella, just 12 years old at the time of the wedding, was humiliated. The daughter of Philip IV of France, she had been married off for diplomacy, but found herself sidelined by a man she could not compete with. The insult would fester for years, and in time would turn into fury. Meanwhile, Edward's reckless favoritism destabilized his kingdom. The barons, led by his cousin Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, demanded Gaveston's exile. Edward agreed, then broke his promise. Again and again, and in 1312, their patience snapped. Gaveston was captured, executed, stabbed, and beheaded by the roadside like a criminal, Edward's heart shattered. He vowed vengeance, but he was no warrior king. Surrounded, isolated, and grieving, he made peace with his lover's murderers. What began as an act of love had now torn a kingdom apart, and Edward, still wearing the crown, was more alone than ever. In the years following Piers Gaveston's death, Edward II descended into deeper political chaos. Though devastated by the loss, he did not learn from it. Instead, he repeated the same fatal mistake, placing blind trust in another favorite, Hugh Despenser the Younger and his father, Hugh Despenser the Elder. Where Gaveston had been flamboyant and careless, the Despensers were cunning and ruthless. They became the true power behind the throne, manipulating the grieving king and using his authority to crush enemies, seize lands, and grow obscenely wealthy. Barons were imprisoned, executed, or stripped of everything. Justice was twisted into vengeance. The English nobility, once merely resentful, now trembled under a reign of fear. And in the shadows, another figure was watching, waiting, Queen Isabella. No longer the forgotten child bride, Isabella had grown into a clever and calculating woman. She had endured humiliation, neglect, and public shame. Now, with her son Edward III coming of age, she saw a chance not only for redemption, but for power. In 1325, Edward II sent her to France on a diplomatic mission. But instead of returning, Isabella remained abroad and did something no medieval queen had dared before. She rebelled. She took a lover, Roger Mortimer, a powerful, exiled baron who had escaped from the Tower of London. Together, they began planning a revolution. By September 1326, Isabella and Mortimer invaded England with a small mercenary force. It should have been treason, but to Edward's horror, the people and the nobles welcomed her as a savior. Years of resentment had turned even former allies into enemies. One by one, the king's supporters fell away. Edward fled with the Despensers, desperately trying to escape, but there was no refuge. Hugh Despenser the Younger was captured and subjected to one of the most gruesome executions in English history. Dragged through the streets, hanged but cut down alive, castrated, his genitals burned before his eyes, his intestines were pulled out and set on fire while he still breathed, and finally he was beheaded. His head was placed on London Bridge, a symbol of what happened to those who betrayed the realm. As for Edward II, he was taken alive, a king no longer. Stripped of power, dignity, and allies, he was forced to abdicate in favor of his 14-year-old son, Edward III. But Isabella and Mortimer were not content with deposition. They wanted closure, they wanted silence, and that would soon come. In the cold, dark cells of Berkeley Castle, after his forced abdication in January 1327, Edward II, once King of England, was no longer a monarch, but a political liability. Though he had been removed from the throne, he was still alive, and too many. That posed a dangerous threat. At first, he was kept in relatively humane conditions, but by April, he was transferred to the remote Berkeley Castle. Under the custody of Thomas Berkeley, along with two men whose names would later echo with infamy, John Maltravers and Thomas Gurney. From that moment, Edward's treatment changed. Drastically gone were the soft beds and respectful guards. Their place came deliberate cruelty, hidden beneath a veil of silence. Chronicles suggest he was kept in filthy, unsanitary conditions, with rotting food, rats, and minimal human contact. His clothes were removed. He was forced to ride without trousers. His skin chafed raw from friction and exposure, a calculated effort to humiliate and degrade him. But the worst torment was psychological. They let him hope and crushed it. They whispered to visitors who never came, of forgiveness that never arrived. Some accounts say clergy were denied access, and loyal servants were turned away. His world shrank to 4 stone walls, the weight of chains, and the echo of footsteps that brought only pain. Why not simply execute him? Because Isabella and Mortimer needed him to die, but not by their hands. If Edward died of natural causes, they would remain free of guilt in the eyes of the church and of history. It was slow-motion murder, veiled in plausible deniability. But Edward, to their surprise, refused to die. he endured. Week after week, he clung to life with stubborn strength, even as the castle walls seemed to close in. Whispers began to spread. The old king still lives. Rumors of rescue began to circulate. Supporters, perhaps even foreign sympathizers, were said to be planning a daring rescue. That was when everything changed. In September 1327, with public sentiment growing restless and Isabella's patience running thin, a decision was made, a final, irreversible act. Whatever happened that night, it would be designed to leave no marks, no trace, only silence. And in that silence, a legend would be born of red-hot iron, muffled screams, and a death too cruel to be real, but too powerful to be forgotten. September 21st, 1327. In the depths of Berkeley Castle, beneath torchlit stone and the weight of betrayal, Edward II met a death so horrific it would become one of the darkest tales in the chronicles of monarchy. Two men entered his cell under cover of night, agents of silence, bearing no sword, no rope, no poison. Instead, they carried something far more symbolic: a red-hot iron rod, a hollow horn tube. What happened next would become the stuff of whispered legend, according to the most infamous account, written decades later by Geoffrey Le Baker. Edward was immobilized, a horn inserted into his anus, and through it, the red-hot iron pushed deep into his body. His internal organs were burned from within, while his screams were muffled with pillows, leaving no visible wounds. Only the smell of scorched flesh, the contorted face of agony, and the silence that followed. The official cause of death: natural causes. But can we trust this version? That's the question that divides historians to this day. The red-hot iron story, though engraved in public imagination, has only appeared in records decades later, long after the event. Some believe it was political propaganda, a lurid tale meant to shock, to punish, and to symbolically tie Edward's death to his alleged homosexuality. It was a method of killing designed not just to end life, but to erase dignity, to turn a king into a cautionary tale. And yet this version is filled with holes. Why would the killers choose such a risky, complicated, and cruel method if silence and discretion were the goals? Why not suffocate him, as was often done? Why the theater of such a monstrous act? Some scholars suggest a more plausible scenario. Edward may have been smothered, either with pillows or hands, a method that left no external signs, no blood, no scandal. Others go further still, proposing that Edward wasn't murdered at all, because just a few years later, someone claiming to be Edward II resurfaced in Europe. A new twist to an already twisted tale. The fire may have burned that night, but whether it burned a king, a corpse, or the truth itself remains one of the great medieval mysteries. For centuries, the tale of Edward II's horrific death seemed certain. A king betrayed, tortured, and silenced. But in the shadows of history, another story began to emerge, one that shook the foundation of that terrible night in Berkeley Castle. In 1330, just 3 years after Edward's supposed death, his son Edward III took full power. He executed Roger Mortimer, exiled his own mother, Queen Isabella, and declared a new beginning. But in the years that followed, rumors began to swirl, strange, persistent whispers that Edward II was not dead at all. Then, in 1333, a letter arrived. It was written by an Italian priest named Mano Fieschi, and it claimed something extraordinary. Edward II had escaped. According to Fieschi's account, Edward had fled Berkeley Castle with the help of sympathizers. A porter's corpse was embalmed and passed off as the dead king. Meanwhile, the real Edward traveled through Ireland, then France, and finally settled in Italy. Living as a hermit, disguised and forgotten, is this mere fantasy? Or is it possible? Supporters of the theory point to several oddities. The embalming of Edward's body would have made it impossible to verify wounds. The funeral at Gloucester Cathedral was elaborate, but few saw the body. And a man calling himself William the Welshman appeared at the court of the Holy Roman Emperor in Koblenz, claiming to be none other than Edward II. Some dismissed him as an impostor. Others, including imperial officials, treated him with strange deference. Was this desperate political theater, or a glimpse of truth? What gives this theory more weight is that Edward III did not laugh it off. Instead, he treated the Fieschi letter with seriousness. He punished those associated with his father's alleged murder, exiling John Maltravers and pursuing Thomas Gurney across Europe until his death in exile. Was this an act of justice for a murdered father? Or guilt for covering up a deeper secret? Historians remain divided. Some argue the escape theory is wishful legend, the kind of tale history loves to tell. Others say there is enough ambiguity, enough motive, and enough silence to make it disturbingly plausible, because in a world ruled by thrones and daggers, the greatest weapon isn't always steel. Sometimes it's the absence of truth, a void where history dares not look, and into that void, Edward II may have disappeared, not as a king, but as a man who survived his own death. In December 1327, just 3 months after the supposed death of Edward II, a state funeral was held at Gloucester Cathedral. The ceremony was grand, dignified, and deeply symbolic, the kind of funeral given only to royalty. The body, whoever it truly belonged to, had been embalmed, its face and form preserved beyond recognition. For the public, it was Edward. The king was dead. Was it rue him best? Was it really him? The tomb erected over the grave is one of the most elaborate of its era. An alabaster effigy shows Edward II in full royal regalia, serene, composed, almost saintly. His eyes closed in eternal peace, his hands folded in prayer, untouched by agony or betrayal. It is a statue of forgiveness, of silence, of contradiction. Because by the time that tomb was sealed, the world had already begun rewriting his story. The tale of the red-hot iron began to circulate widely in the 1350s, particularly through Geoffrey Le Baker's dramatic chronicle. It was not just a murder anymore. It was a moral lesson, a message that kings who transgress boundaries, especially sexual ones, would meet the most symbolic punishments. The death became theater, and the man became myth. But Edward III, now king in his own right, seemed to wrestle with the ghost of his father. He had Mortimer executed in 1330. He imprisoned his mother in gentle confinement for the rest of her life. And he commissioned the royal tomb at Gloucester himself, a gesture not of political necessity, but perhaps of personal grief. Was it atonement, or a carefully constructed veil to cover the truth? Over the centuries, Edward II's tomb became a pilgrimage site, not just for the devout, but for the curious, for those drawn by the strange tension between the peaceful king in stone and the tortured man of legend. There are no iron rods here, no blood, no fire, only silence, beautifully carved, and in that silence lies the question that history cannot answer. Was Edward II buried here as a man defeated, or honored here as a king who never truly died? Nearly 700 years have passed, yet the story of Edward II continues to haunt the memory of England, not just because of the horror that may have ended his life, but because of the questions he left behind. Was he a weak ruler, brought down by poor judgment, dangerous love, and political blindness? Or was he a man ahead of his time, someone who dared to defy the rigid expectations of masculinity, kingship, and public conformity? His reign was marked by failure, military defeat, Bannockburn, the loss of his father's legacy, and the alienation of his court. And yet, at the heart of his story lies something deeply human, a longing for connection, for loyalty, for love that did not have to hide. History has not been kind to Edward II. For centuries, he was painted as effeminate, incompetent, even perverse. A cautionary tale of how personal weakness can topple a kingdom. But behind those judgments is the cruel truth of medieval politics. A king was allowed to be ruthless, but never vulnerable. His alleged lovers, Gaveston and Despenser, were not just rivals to the court. They were threats to the rigid world of alliances, bloodlines, and masculine dominance. And in that world, as great as crime may not have been poor governance, but emotional transparency. Whether he died in screaming agony by iron and flame, or in quiet exile under a false name, whether his tomb holds his body or that of a nameless double, Edward II remains one of history's most enduring enigmas. His life was a contradiction. A king by blood, but never by nature. A man of tenderness in an age of brutality. A monarch who ruled an empire, but could not rule his own fate. And so, in Gloucester Cathedral, beneath the carved alabaster figure of a serene, sleeping king, a question still echoes. Who was Edward II? Really? A tragic fool? A hidden survivor? Broken romantic? A martyr of identity in an age that allowed no deviation? Perhaps he was all of them. And that, above all, is why we cannot forget him.